relevant studies and the establishment of international cooperative research projects in the last few decades. So this paper focuses on the Jug Vasishta, or Persian translations of the Yoga Vasishta among Persian translation texts, which Professor Abidi worked on. The Yoga Vasishta is a Sanskrit philosophical text in the style of collections of frame stories. Its authorship is attributed to Valmiki. The Yoga Vasishta consists of 6 prakaranas or parts, and each part includes stories and anecdotes as well as philosophical implications, whose aim and end is Jiva Mukti, or liberation in life, through realizing that one's Atman, or inner self, and Brahman, or ultimate reality of the universe, are the same. The outermost layer of this work is the Valmiki's address toward his disciple Bharadvaja about a long dialogue between Rama, a prince of Kosala kingdom, and the main role of the epic Ramayana, and a holy sage, Vasishta. Although the text of the Yoga Vasishta contains parallels with the Ramayana and Bhagavad Gita, its content has almost nothing to do with those two epics. The first prakarana is called Vairagya, that means detachment. The sage Vishwamitra was invited by the king of Dasharatha to Kosala kingdom, where he met the prince Rama. Rama expresses his anguish on the nature of human and the world. The second prakarana, Mumukshu, meaning longing for liberation, brings readers to philosophical thinking. The sage Vasishta tells Rama about the origin of I-ness and the universe. The third prakarana, Utpatti, was a part of arising, describes how Parabrahman, or the Absolute One, turns to Brahma, or the Creator, as well as its relation to I-ness. According to this part, there is no essential difference between the Absolute One and I, myself. The fourth sticky prakarana was a part of maintenance, describes the nature of I and the world, demonstrating non-dualistic views in the interpolated stories. The fifth Upashama prakarana was a part of tranquility, describes that having realized that all are Absolute One and I, they are same, and Rama should destroy the idea of dualism that I and the universe are different. The last Nirvana prakarana was a part of extinction, is the longest part that occupies nearly half of the entire text, that deals with the state of enlightenment and bliss which Rama attained. Finally, the Prince Rama accomplished a liberation in life. According to the recent studies, the earliest recension of the Yoga Vasishta text was composed in the 10th century Kashmir, which was called the Mokshopaya, was a means of liberation. Probably during the reign of the Kashmiri king Yashaskara, or soon after, an anonymous author composed the Mokshopaya at the hill of the center of Srinagar, Pradyumnadri, present-day Hariparvat. Based on the Mokshopaya, 2 versions of the Yoga Vasishta were produced in the medieval period between the 10th century and the 13th century. The longer recension is the so-called Brihat Yoga Vasishta, comprising 27,687 verses, and the shorter recension is the Raghu Yoga Vasishta, comprising 8,013 verses. Although the long and short recensions both maintain the structure of the Mokshopaya that consists of 6 prakaranas, whose main part is long dialogue with Rama and Vasishta. But philosophical tendencies are different between the Mokshopaya and Yoga Vasishtas. The philosophy of the Mokshopaya is monistic, non-dualistic, but not inclined to a particular philosophical school. Indeed, the author of the Mokshopaya intendedly took in philosophies from Buddhism and various schools of Hinduism. Thus, the non-dualistic worldview is consistent through this work. In contrast, the philosophy of both Brihat and Raghu Yoga Vasishtas is inclined to non-dualistic Vedanta, one of the influential schools of Indian philosophy. In other words, the essential philosophical view had shifted from neutral monism to non-dualistic Vedanta. Interestingly, the Mokshopaya and the Yoga Vasishtas attracted not only Hindus but also Muslim rulers on the subcontinent. A contemporary Sanskrit source reports that the 8th Shamirid ruler of Kashmir, Sultan Zainul Abidin, had a court pandit recited the Mokshopaya, and his son and successor, Sultan Haidar Shah, also did so. Moreover, at least an emperor and two princes of the Mughal Empire supervised respectively Persian translations of the Raga Yoga Vasishta. The shorter version. The earliest case was won by Prince Salim, the future fourth emperor Jahangir, in 1597 to 98. At that time, the prince was stationed in Allahabad as a governor and waited for his father, the third emperor Akbar's death. The prince ordered a Muslim intellect at his station named Nizamuddin Panipati to make a Persian translation of the Raga Yoga Vasishta. Panipati completed the translation with the help of two Hindu pandits, Patan Mishra Jajipuri and Jagannatha Mishra Banarasi. Professor Sayyid Muhammad Reza Jalali Naini published a critical edition of Panipati's translation from Tehran in 1981. Soon after the comprehension of the Salim version, the feud between Akbar and Salim became apparent, which resulted in the assassination of Akbar's confidant, Abul Fazl, in August 1602, by the conspiracy of Salim. Their discord ended in 1604, 1 year before Akbar's death. When the discord continued, Akbar commissioned to produce another Persian translation of the Raga Yoga Vasishta in 1602, probably soon after Abul Fazl's assassination. A less-known Muslim intellect named Farmuri made the translation. According to his self-assessment on the two manuscripts, the translator Farmuri was a disciple of a famous mystic poet and Bhakti saint of Banarasi, Kabir. However, due to the time difference between the possible lifetimes of the two persons, Kabir and Farmuri, it is more probable that Farmuri was not a direct disciple of Kabir, but one who belonged to Kabir Pant. The text of the Akbar version has been unedited so far due to uneasy accessibility to the extant manuscripts. One manuscript copied in December 1602, the same year of the public production, is held at the Chester Beatty Library of Dublin. And another one is in the Punjab Public Library in Lahore. Dr. Pegash Sharbats and I are preparing a critical edition of the Akbar version based on these two manuscripts. The third translation was produced in 1656, more than a half century after the two preceding translations. Its commissioner was tragic prince of the Emperor Shah Jahan, Dara Shikoh. This translation is perhaps the most famous one because Dara Shikoh has been regarded as the prince who made a commitment to Hindu philosophy among Western scholars. A lithograph of the Dara version was published in Kanpur in 1883. And as mentioned above, Professor Hassan Abidi and Tara Chand published a critical edition of this version in 1968. The identification of the translator is still room for argument. Although Professor Abdi suggested that Banwari Das, the author of the Gulzar Har, took part in this translation project. And recently, Dr. Supriya Gandhi ratified his suggestion. This is a manuscript of Akbar version. And on the right margin, here is the autograph of Jahangir. And this is a miniature from the Dublin manuscript of the Akbar version. Oh, sorry, time is very short. I have to skip some points. Yeah, notwithstanding Professor Abidi's and Professor Jalali Nani's editions of the two translations, the number of studies focused on the Persian translation of the Raga Yoga Vasishta are very limited. But recently, some remarkable researches are published. One is by Professor Muzaffar Alam, which deals with the Dara version. He thinks that why Dara made this translation. He presumes that the imperial authority and translation project. And another important work is by Dr. Shankar Nair. This deals with the philosophy in the Salim version. Due to the time, I have to skip the detail of these researches. And having got the studies by Muzaffar Alam and Shankar Nair, we can now expand the range of studies in the Persian translation of the Raga Yoga Vasishta, especially comparing the translation strategy of Sanskrit philosophy and narrative styles between the three translations, the Salim version, the Akbar version, and the Dara version. For example, a textual comparison between the Salim version and the Akbar version may help to depict a clearer image of scholarly connection between the Mughal court and Hindu intellectuals at the end of the 16th century. As mentioned above, the Prince Salim's translation team was in Allahabad when they completed their translation, while the Akbar version was probably produced in Agra. The fact raises the question whether Akbar and Salim could utilize the same group of pandits when they were confrontational. In his monograph, Shankar Naik suggests that Jagannatha Mishra Banarasi among the Salim's translation team could access the recent teachings of the contemporary Vedantin Madhusudana Sarasvati. And he further claims that the text of Salim version reflects Madhusudana and other contemporary Vedantins' arguments on Drishti Shrishtivada and Ekajivavada. On the other hand, it has been to be examined whether the composer of the Akbar version, Farumri, and his possible assistant took part in the same kind of contemporary network of thinkers. Although I had yet to reach a conclusion about this issue, I instead would like to introduce a passage in the Akbar version. This passage is the opening part of the Utpatti Prakarana, where Farumri explains various kinds of naming for the stage of self-disclosure of absolute existence. This passage reminds us of similarly to Madhusudana's argument on the relations of Brahman and Jiva. But this example suggests Farumri's intention to explain the views of a wider range of the schools of Sanskrit philosophy, inclusively, on the basis of the oneness of existence, Vahdatul Wujud. So I changed the file of sharing. So this is a transcription and English translation, but yeah, so time is limited, sorry. So this is the text of the Akbar version, and it's an English translation. This both will be published on the proceedings, sorry. So what the passage makes clear is at once is Farumri's reference to Jiva and Pratibimbita reflected as the first stage of self-individualization of the absolute existence, which reminds us of Madhusudana's argument on Jiva. While he further tried to explain other concepts such as Brahmana and Ahankara as other aspects of self-individualization claimed by other schools of philosophy. Another point we should note is the absence of Ishvara and Avidya, or their Persian counterparts, in spite of Farumri's wide range of loanwords. And another example, I would like to show the relationship about Vasana and Jiva Mukti. But
so you have only 3 minutes left.
Yeah, I have to skip this passage and I have to conclude. Sorry. So where should I read? Throughout the text, the style of the Salim version is analytical. The translation team interprets thoughtfully commentary on Sanskrit technical terms on philosophy, person, topography, etc., etc. Their translation policy thus is given to making the target text redundant. The text of the Ogura version can be characterized by its aesthetic textual style. While the Sarin version tries to facilitate readability with analytical commentaries on Sanskrit themes in the source text, the Ogura version has an orientation to construct beautiful sentences that look like Persian mystical poems. For example, Farmuri likes to use the expression Rai Heye Danish or fragrance of knowledge and Buye Danish Ha or smell of knowledge. Such metaphor to correlate knowledge to the sense of smell is characteristic in the Ogura version. Farmuri's interpretation of the philosophy in the Laghu Yoga Vasishta is basically same with that of the Sarin version, but his expression is more abstract to some extent. In our short study, on several examples can be shown here. When comparisons of the whole of these three translations and the Sanskrit source text will be done, and comparative glossary of translating specific terms will be prepared. And we can depict a clear image of the aspects of the Mughal Persian translations of the Laghu Yoga Vasishta. We barely get a clue to utilize Professor Hassan Abi's academic legacy and make it inherited by the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So you were listening to Professor Satoshi Ogura. Thank you, sir. This was very informative. Now we are open for question and answer session. If anyone wants to ask question, they can ask. Just to mention here that each speaker will be given 20 minutes, and I'll inform him when only 3 minutes are left. That would be a reminder. So if anyone wants to ask question, they can unmute themselves and please ask questions. Thank you all. It seems no one is willing to ask questions, so we'll continue. So our next speaker is Professor Moin Nizami from Punjab University, Lahore, but unfortunately he cannot attend the conference. So our next paper would be of Professor Azarmi Dukht Safavi, who is Director of Institute of Persian Research, Aligarh Muslim University. So Dr. Safavi has also withdrawn from the conference due to health issues. So her paper will be read by Professor Bilqis Fatma Hussaini. And the topic of his paper is Professor Abadi and Sabke Hindi. Over to you, Bilqis ma'am.
Hello. Assalamu alaikum. मैं माजरत के साथ खनम सफवी का पेपर पढ़ रही हूँ और दुआ कर रही हूँ कि परवरदिगार आलम उनको जल्द अज जल्द शफा दे. The title of her paper is Indo-Persian Literature, Mirror of Indian History and Culture, Case Study Ved Islam. हर मकामी मानिए तगीर हाव मी परवरत आब अगर दर बर्ग बाशद सब्ज पर गुल अहमर است. One should not imagine that Bedil, a mystic poet and a scholar, though he was, did not take notice of what was happening around him, or that he, belonging to foreign race, was not particularly interested in India. This will be a wrong perception of the poet's temperament and his attitude, contrary to what one may assume about poets and writers. about poets and writers regarding their difference or ignorance or disinterest in matters more materialistic and mundane. The possessing a more sensitive mind and better and keener observation, in fact, could be, that is, if they choose to be so, a far better observer and chronicler of events, happenings, undercurrents, responses, and reactions, political and socio-cultural scenario unfolding before them than others. Bedil is a striking example. Despite his mystic tendencies, total involvement with the poetic muse, aloof temperament from the royal courts, and philosophic detachment from day-to-day events, he has written extensively about India, his native land, its different regions, and its flora and fauna, customs and culture, people and their lives, wars and conflicts, rituals and beliefs, religions and mythology, ideas and thousands of other interesting aspects of India and Indians. His prose writing, for example, Chahar, Unsur, Luqat, etc., and his Masnavis, Surya Marifat, Irfan, Mohit Azam, etc., even his lyrics are all important and valuable sources of information about India. In this short essay, it is not possible to gather them all together. However, some presentative examples will be cited. Bidil, शायर, आरिफ हो, फिलसूफ हो, बशर दोस्त, बावजूद मशगूलियत और सरगर्मी, बाअफ्कार मुतसव्विर फानी, रुझान बे सैर बातिन, तू ज़गुंचे कम न दमी दे, ऐ दरे दिल कुशो बे चमन दरा. हरगिज़ व हीच वक्त از اوضاع و احوال و زمان خود و تغیرات و تحولات سیاسی و اجتماعی کشور چشم نبسته و بی خبر و بی پروا نبوده است. نشو و نما و تکامل پذیری و بلوغ فکری این شاعر صاحب نظر مرهون و ناشی از شرایط و عوامل تاریخی در پیرامون وی می باشد. چنان که از بررسی آثار او برمی آید، علاوه بر محیط فرهنگی و اجتماعی و کیفیات جغرافیایی، مناظر طبیعی مثل سبزه و گل و ماهتاب و کوه و دریا و هزار موجودات خارجی نه فقط ذهنی و فکری بلکه معمار و سازنده شخصیت شعری و فنی او بوده است. خودش میگوید تا نسخه اندیشه از هستی رقم تو همی دارد، با حرز سودان مکتب امتیاز هم سبق بودن ناچاری است و تا خم ما و من از نفس سطر خیالی می نگارد به هم مشقی اطفال این دبستان فرسوده بی اختیاری. در آب افتاده را هوای دامن از دود کشیدن داغ خجالت. برای بیدل هر فضا مستلزم هوا نیست و هر فرد مقتضای نوا نیست. برای بیدل هر فضا مستلزم هوایی است و هر پرده مقتضای نوایی. او معترف است بعضی اوقات شعر او در نتیجه واقعات و حادثات هر روزه زندگی از پرده تأمل به منصه شهود رونما شده و در ذیل فواید صحبت از چاک بیرنگی رنگ پذیرفته است. از آن جمله و ارادتی که در ضمن بعضی احوال از پرده تتق بیرنگی چهره وقوع گشوده و به جلوهگاه تحریر می آورد تا مبرهن گردد که خیالات بیدل هم عالمی دارد. As mentioned earlier, Bedil grew up in a time of great turmoil. Shah Jahan's benign rule has been abruptly put to an end by his ambitious son Aurangzeb, and the continuous wars of succession have started. Bedil was a witness to all these circumstances. A man of traditional values, he shows his aversion to Aurangzeb's aggressive policies of imprisoning his old and ailing father and cruelly eliminating his brothers one way or the other from the race to the Mughal throne. Some of his verses reflect the conditions of that time, throwing light on the rapidly changing political scenario of 17th century India. His poetry also refers to Shah Jahan's prosperous reign. According to him, it was an auspicious time when people were happy with the emperor and there was peace in the country. دور السعدی بود و عهد امن و ایام شریف خلق در حمد خدا از عدل شاه نیک پی کامران شاهی چون نگذشته در اقلیم دهر کمترین چاکرانش پادشاه مصر و ری. Bedil has composed these couplet after his written from his travels from Bihar, Bengal and Odisha. Throughout his journey, he has observed people and places and was impressed with what he had seen, and his words and verses bear testimony to the fact that during Shah Jahan's period, people were generally living a peaceful, contented life. This is an eyewitness account and may be considered important as it stands in direct contrast with Jan Ripka, the European historian, who said, the extravagance of this king, Shah Jahan, and the money that he spent in building the Taj Mahal and for the peacock throne damaged the country's economy and made the people unhappy. Bedil's words negate Ripka's opinion. Dr. Abdul Ghani also confirms Bedil's perception and has written that the preparation of the peacock throne and building of the Taj Mahal, the Red Fort, and the Shah Jahani Mosque gave employment to thousands of the poor, and they earned their livelihood by this labor. Bedil also lamented the death of the emperor by composing an elegy in which he again praises Shah Jahan for his generosity, kindness, and justice, comparing his time to the springtime of India because people were happy and prosperous. As we know, Shah Jahan had nominated his son Dara Shukoo as his heir during his own lifetime. But as he was aware of the jealousies and conflicts among the brothers, he had given them different provinces to rule. Bengal to Shah Shuja, Deccan to Aurangzeb, and Gujarat to Murad Bas, when in 1758 AD Shah Jahan was taken suddenly ill. Rebellion started among his sons. They were against Dara Shukoo, and each began to gather army and money to capture Delhi and the Mughal throne. Bedil was watching the ever-changing scenario, albeit from the peripheries, but his reaction and comments on the greed and lust for power of the princes are abundantly available in his poetry as well as prose writing. For example, in his biography, Chahar Yunsur, Bedil describes his political upheaval in these words. साली के शाह शुजाउद्दीन शाहजहां बीमारी पेदर्रा सिकते मजमून सल्तनत अंदिशीदे जम्बे जुनूनी बीता मुल्ब अज़्म दारुल खिलाफे दहली कशीद ता पाये हवस बर मंबर हवस बेखुतबे बाद बुलंद करताना है मुतसद्दियान उमूर از خطه بنگال تا سرحد ممالک بهار به گردآوری خزائن فتوح موج می‌گماشتند. In the year Shah Shuja imagined his father's illness to be a hindrance in the governance. This is the translation. He, with the intention of capturing Delhi throne, began to thoughtlessly divert his mad passion so that he may elevate his pulpit of lust with his pompous khutbah. Executive appointed armies from Bengal to the reign of Bihar for collecting treasures and spent a lot of money to acquire gold and jewels. در عین دار و گیر در عین داروگیر استقلال که صدای غلغل لشکر پای صدمه بر کوه می افشرد، جاسوسان کمینگاه خبر آوردند که در الہ آباد دو دریای بیکران به هم در افتاد. It must be kept in mind that Vidil was not a historian or a chronicler and did not always describe events explicitly or directly. His expression is sometimes poetic and he hints at the state of the affairs in an implicit manner. At certain times, his choice of a particular word may be enough to show his reaction, or may contain a comment on the situation. In the above quotation, he uses two words which are indicative of Bedil's opinion on the entire unfortunate events. Havas, yani lust, junoon bi ta'ammul, thoughtless or unchecked madness. With these two epithets, Bedil has successfully conveyed his dislike for Shuja's action and his behavior. When Shuja rose against his brother Aurangzeb later on, Bedil also wrote about the battle that took place between their armies at Kajwa near Allahabad in 1658 AD. Jar Unsul gives us an account of the ferocity of the battle. Here she has explained in detail, and I am skipping it from here because time is less. Bedil's account is vivid description of the condition of that transitory period when he says it was better to be confined in four walls of one's house if one wanted to stay safe. According to him, not only the cities, also small villages were not peaceful and secure. Not only was he a poet and scholar of great distinction, he had commented of the melody political imams of masjid, sheikh and Sufis. He comments upon the temporariness and fickleness of the royal throne, a fact much evidence during his time. Girodare auj daulat ha gubari bish neez bar hawa chungar baud orang bishni. All the royal thrones are swept in the air like a whirlwind. Mashud Hizaur Baud, Hilalo, Hilal, Badr, Didim, Wazi Aulam, Naqsu, Kamal. गिरफ्ते अस्त हवादिस जहान इम्कान राव ज़आफियत चे ज़मीनों चे आसमान खालीस. According to him, she has given translation, but I am skipping. According to him, happiness and peace have bade farewell to the world, and it is now gripped by turmoil. Bedil is upset by the narrow vision, shallowness, and selfishness of those who rule, and he finds that there is no friendship, temptation, and sincerity left in the world. Where can one take one with whom can one share one's difficulty? It is better that we should sit at home and not mix with anyone, because we do not who is our friend. Who is our friend and who is a foe? However, one may search for a true friend and love. One is doomed to fail in his search, as these things have left this world. It is better to remain silent, because you never know which of your friends is in fact a cheater and will double cross you. Az har se dam zani be khamushi hawale kun in anjuman puras de ghammaw se ashna. Bedil has criticized most of the elite classes also. According to Bedil, India is, I am skipping here, he has mentioned about the different cities and culture. For example, as can be ascertained from his poetry and prose, Bedil has traveled extensively during his lifetime. For example, Odisha, Bihar, Bengal, Mewat, Mathura, Banaras, Allahabad, Shahjahanabad, Agra, Lahore, and many other Indian towns and cities have been mentioned in his work. Especially in his Chahar Unsur, Bedil was writing detail about routes, travel, modes of journey like Drushke, Behli, Palki, Gadi Gao, Gadi, etc. Agricultural implements, blacksmiths, furnace and seasons and climates, orchards and fields, shops and markets and traders and festivals and rituals, caravans and travels, life in villages and towns, journey and its hazards, local social norms, religious celebrations, cultural activities, provisions available at different manzils, yani stoppages in a journey, elephant racing, horse racing, archery,
خیلی
eating,
معذرت
and
میخوام
its
استاد ببخشید خیلی معذرت میخوام استاد فقط 3 دقیقه مونده 3 دقیقه مونده 3 minutes are left خیلی معذرت
بهرحال من مقاله را کوتاه میخونم ولی بهرحال چند دقیقه اگه شما به من میدهید خیلی ممنون میشم. According to Bedil, India is the land of beauty and grace, which is equal to paradise. He admires its flowers, rivers, mountains, stars, studded skies, clouds, and colorful scenery, rainy weather, rivers, and spring, merrily chirping birds, tall trees, green pastures, thousands of other natural phenomena in his Masnavi Mohit-e-Azam. Under its fifth chapter in 9 continuous titles, Bedil has described the natural beauty of India. रंग गुलिस्तान, कैफियत चमन, कैफियत बहार, कैफियत नुमू, कैफियत तरावत, कैफियत सब्जे, कैफियत शगुफ्तगी, कैफियत रंग बू, कैफियत बहार जुनून. I am skipping here from in the year 1078, Bedil had gone to Mathura and he witnessed the city Mathura and the love of gopis and Krishna, which was discussed among the people of that city, and he is so fond of that city that he doesn't want to leave. The author has mentioned here about the city of Mathura and their culture. I am not reading here, and now I am about information about different profession and professions like an ironmongers, physicians, astronomers, painters. It has been dealt here in, and he says that is also described with great interest and detail the skill and accomplishment in sketching, making portraits, paintings, etc. Anup Chitra, the famous artist of Aurangzeb's time, Bedil writes that Anup Chitra was renowned for his art throughout India, from north to south. He lived during the period of Aurangzeb and had requested Bedil the permission to make his portrait. Anup Chitra's expertise in his art was fascinating. The soul of the masters of art, Mani and Behzad, dance in colorful dresses around him, and his mastery has put them to shame. He made Bedil's portrait after taking permission from him, and Bedil was amazed when he saw his image on paper. He writes, "My mirror image was like a flawed photo before that. However, I tried but could not distinguish myself from Anup Chitra's sketch." She has mentioned a lot about the dancers and Brahmins and their habits, and about Prayagraj and Kumbh Mela. I am skipping all the beauties of her article. And here I am telling about a few sentences, few paragraphs.
Ma'am, your time is up. I'm sorry.
Pardon me. One page. I am, and I have the conclusion I am presenting here. Don't worry. Bedil's letters are all also full of information about important personalities and carried out by the king's command, outcome of these expeditions, dates of the constructions of various buildings, food, mass, etc., chronograms of different events, and many other important historical and social happenings. These letters have been written to Shah Azam, Nawab Shukrullah Khan, Aqil Khan, Razi, etc., etc. To sum up, this is just a very brief analysis to point out that Bedil was not only a trendsetter in Persian poetry, but was also a keen observer of the political and social conditions of his time. His poetry and prose are tapestry of interesting events, information, and response that shed light on the Indian society and political events of the last decades of the Mughal Empire. A detailed and thorough study of his works will be of great help in comprehending and analyzing the 16th and 17th century of Indian history. It is hoped that this short essay will serve as an appetizer to the great intellectual feast that has been provided by Bedil's works for scholars and historians. And I think it is a best appetizer for us, the listeners, and of this program. Thank you all.
خیلی ممنون استاد، خیلی زحمت کشیدی. مقاله خانم صفوی مطالب خیلی جالب داشت و بسیار آموزنده بود. اطلاعات زیادی به دست آوردیم. خیلی ممنون. Okay, so our next paper would be of Dr. Anjali Duhan Gulia. She's a fellow of Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla. She also teaches history of art at the Department of Visual Arts, Maharishi Dayanand University, Haryana. The topic of his paper would be the Tuthi Name, the text and idea. Over to you, Ms. Anjali. Please unmute yourself.
Just 1 second, I have to give her the rights for the, let me see where her name.
Share screen.
I wanted to share the screen for my presentation.
Yeah, just 1 second.
Okay, you've got the permission.
Now, just 1 second.
I've allowed her, sir.
Okay, fine. Now it's done.
Ma'am, please unmute yourself.
I wanted to share the screen, so after that I thought I'll start. I've done that. Share. Is it visible to all now?
It's coming.
Okay,
Yes, it is visible.
thank you. So am I audible? Is the screen visible?
Yes, screen
Okay,
is visible.
thank you.
And you are
Yeah.
audible also. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm truly delighted to present my work at such prestigious conference, and I'm thankful to the organizers, especially Mr. Suhail Abidi, for providing me with this opportunity. Before I commence, I must acknowledge the immense benefit I have received from the towering scholarship of Professor Abidi. Further, I intend to state that I'm an art historian with a specialization in Mughal paintings. However, apart from discussing the style of Tutinama miniatures here, I will also share my observations mainly related to the various themes embedded in this text, which may perhaps seem primary to some of the experts of literature present here. The Tutinama, or the Tales of the Parrot, text is assumed to be a Persian translation of the Sanskrit text Shuk Saptati, 70 Tales of the Parrot. Both the Sanskrit and the Persian framework stories are too well known to be repeated here, so I'll directly go to the two texts. Shuk Saptati belongs to the Katha genre, where the framed story engulfs several anecdotes which predominantly deal with the sexual liaison outside of marriage, the problematic but exciting situations one finds oneself in these relationships, and the ingenious ways to escape them from those crises. It also borrows from multiple preceding texts like the popular Panchtantra tale of the crocodile and the monkey, and the two friends Dharm Buddhi and Pap Buddhi are embedded here. Additionally, the Shuk Saptati includes verses or quotations from epics and Purans, Kama Sutra, Arth Shastra, and also the Kumara Sambhav. Current scholarship believes that Shuk Saptati in its present form belongs to the 12th century Common Era, and it was translated into several languages, pointing to its immense popularity. This article is concerned with the Persian version of the Shuk Saptati called as the Tutinama, some of its ideas and how they are represented in the visual medium. The Shuk Saptati was translated into Persian for the first time by Imad al-Din Tagri, a court secretary of Alauddin Khalji, with the title of Jawahir al-Asmar. Pega Shahbaz, and I know she's present here, has noted that the translator increased the number of tales to 86 from the original 70 and adapted them into the Persianate world. He did not include every tale from the Shuk Saptati in his text, but he was discerning in his selection, deleted and replaced a few, and other parables from other Sanskrit sources such as Panchtantra and Katha Sarit Sagar were included. So the Jawahir al-Asmar had some translated stories from the Shuk Saptati. Subsequently, Jia al-Din Naqshbandi, who was a Chishti Sufi and an author living in Badaयूं, Uttar Pradesh, perhaps accessed the Jawahir al-Asmar and maybe Shuk Saptati also, and composed his own version of these tales in about circa 1329 Common Era, which is the Tutinama. He retained the original frame story about but altered the ending where Madan, who is now Maimun, the husband, kills Khujashta, who was Prabhavati in Sanskrit, for her desire to be unfaithful. He also reduced the number of tales to only 52. It is often projected about this text that it exclusively consists of tales which present amorous relationships and focus on guiding the woman and curtailing their desires. My examination of it, however, suggests that it is a rich collection of the tales having varied and colorful themes. Of course, there are tales about women and their sexual desires, and beyond doubt, the Tutinama is one of the standard texts to understand the condition of women in the early modern India. Nevertheless, the nature of tales having woman as the main protagonist has been altered. If in the Shuk Saptati, the females are adventurous, open, and accepting about their sexual desires, in the Tutinama, most of them are presented as faithful, faithful, and if they commit adultery, are justified to be punished. The disobedient, manipulative, and adulterous women are either whipped, as in the parable narrated on the 24th night. Ma'am, would you please mute? Ask them to. Yeah. So the disobedient, manipulative, and adulterous women are either whipped, as in the parable narrated on the 24th night, and stoned on the night, and either they are stoned as on the 10th night and the 42nd night, and burnt and trampled by an elephant as on the 22nd night, or their lovers desert them midway and they return back to their husbands as on the 16th night. These are themes or sub-themes of the several stories from this text. What has been noted here with the study of the Tutinama is that the number of tales from the Shuk Saptati are considerably reduced. Some of them are present in the narration of the 8th night as subtexts. Here, each of the female are scheming, witty wives having affairs, enjoying themselves and deceiving their husbands. Alternatively, some stories in the Tutinama also present the ideas of chastity and loyalty in a female, as one told on the 4th night, illustrated with 4 paintings, and is about an astute lady who was a wife of a soldier, jealous and anxious. He always doubted her chastity, in order to impress upon him the fact that if a wife intends to betray her husband, she will find ways. Whatsoever tricks the man employs to stop her. To prove her point, she narrates a story of a skilled Indian yogi who, through his practice, had reached such level that he could transform himself into anything he desired. Being overprotective about his wife and stopping her from committing adultery, he transformed himself into an elephant, carried his wife all the time on his back in a hoda, and lived in the thick forest away from the presence of any male. Still, his spouse had managed to form relationships with 100 men, of whom she kept account by tying knots in a long string. A half-page illustration is devoted to this part of the story, in which the elephant, realistically rendered, is engrossed in eating the lush green leaves from a tree. However, behind his back, his wife is in the close embrace of her lover. Their figures balancing the large form of the elephant on the other side in the composition. The middle portion has an outsized, curtained howdah, the living space of the female amidst the deep jungle, represented here by a cluster of trees created by applying patches of shades of green and yellow. In this manner, the yogi's wife had several encounters with men, and she kept account of all of them by tying knots in a string. After listening to this story, the soldier finally agrees to his wife's advice and went on his business. As an additional proof of her chastity, she gives him a garland of flowers that will remain fresh until the time she will stay loyal to her husband. Her act of handing down the garland is painted on the bottom section of folio 27A of the Cleveland Museum Tutinama. A full-page illustration is devoted to this part of the story, in which the elephant, realistically rendered, is engrossed in eating the lush green leaves from a tree. However, behind his back, his wife is in the close embrace of her lover. Their figures balancing the large form of the elephant on the other side in the composition. The middle portion has an outsized, curtained howdah, the living space of the female amidst the deep jungle, represented here by a cluster of trees created by applying patches of shades of green and yellow. In this manner, the yogi's wife had several encounters with men, and she kept account of all of them by tying knots in a string. After listening to this story, the soldier finally agrees to his wife's advice and went on his business. As an additional proof of her chastity, she gives him a garland of flowers that will remain fresh until the time she will stay loyal to her husband. Her act of handing down the garland is painted on the bottom section of folio 27A of the Cleveland Museum Tutinama here. The composition is divided into three sections: the now empty bedroom, suggesting the painful parting between the two protagonists on the proper right. The middle has the lovely adorned young wife passing on the floral garland to her man, who is completely attired in the paraphernalia of a soldier, and the part on the other proper right, divided from the central portion with a simple floral motif, has the figures of the horse and its attendant standing outside, suggesting the immediate departure of the warrior. The horizontal format, two-dimensional architectural feature, flat background lacking spatial depth, and the wife with angular features and garments which are adorned with bold patterns, all point towards a pre-Mughal style. In the soldier's absence, his wife proves her character as a chaste woman by remaining faithful despite several attempts to seduce her. Once the king of the province, to test her, sent two handsome cooks to her house to entice her. However, she trapped them into a pit by making them sit on a bed made of weak strings. This scene is vividly painted on folio 29A of the Cleveland Museum Tutinama, a cook already lying on the ground and the other one in the motion of falling. The clever lady standing on the top delighted on her success. Subsequently, she brought them out of the pit, shaved their heads, made them dress as maidservants, and kept them in her prison until the king became worried and inquired about their situation. The next painting here represents the king seated, supported by the bolster on a stool, surprised to see the condition of his men, now ashamed of their act, bald and dressed as females, paying homage to him and seeking his forgiveness. He finally understood the power of a chaste woman. Although there are several stories on these lines in the text, there are also narratives edifying us on pragmatism, humility, kingship, and courtly etiquettes, friendship, human nature, dependence on fate, etc. The ones focusing on practical wisdom are drawn primarily from Indian Niti Shastra texts, like a story narrated 24th night is of a merchant from Kabul, his daughter and her 3 suitors, a painter, a poet, and a valorous man. Each promised her hand in marriage. They by employing their skill to rescue her, but the daughter marries the brave youth who risked his life for her. This narrative is borrowed from Vitala Panch Vimshati, the story of Somprabha and her 3 suitors, and in both the versions instruct that a man should be brave enough to protect her wife and face any difficulty to save her. Another anecdote is from Hitopadesh, where there is a foolish donkey braying which alarms a thief, but the master thrashed the donkey. Here the dog was his friend, but in the Tutinama it is the deer that ran away from the donkey and saved himself, whereas the gardeners are beating the donkey. It is important to record here that the stories from Panchtantra, which we had noted earlier in the Shuk Saptati, like the crocodile and the monkey, are absent in the Tutinama. So Nakshabi had also been selective about the content of his book, and he has eliminated or replaced stories even though he was referring to the same texts. Other significant ideas which are present in the Tutinama are etiquettes of kingship and statecraft, which are absent in the Shuk Saptati. The stories devoted to these themes are most likely borrowed from an Islamic or a Sufi milieu. For instance, the 2 stories narrated on the 7th night revealed an exemplar about the motions of a king who is mentioned in the text as the king of the kings. The first is a tale of a poor dervish who was in love with the princess of Bahilistan. The king of that region was obviously against this match, and in order to divert the hermit's obsession, he sought from him an elephant laden with gold. So the dervish went in the court of the king of the kings and requested for the tribute, to which the king of the king obliged. Thereafter, the king of Bahilistan again demanded to bring forth the head of the king of the kings. The latter happily agreed to even this obnoxious demand and permitted the hermit to tie a rope around his neck and led him to the king's court. When the king of the Bahilistan witnessed this modesty of king of the kings, who is far superior from his status and power, but is differential to the pious dervish, he felt ashamed and married his daughter with the king of the kings. This beautiful tale presents the qualities of an ideal monarch as projected from a Sufi lens. Similarly, a story narrated on the 7th night, again about the king of the king. Okay, why is my presentation not moving forward? Just a minute. Yeah. Similarly, a story.
Ma'am, sorry, you have only 3 minutes left.
Okay, I'll just finish the conclusion then.
I think time is not an issue since we don't have to go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. In both the manuscripts, similarly, a story narrated on the 7th night, again about the king of the kings, exemplifies the idea of the merciful ruler when he sacrifices his life by jumping into a cauldron filled with boiling oil for the love of a woman and a jinn. Therefore, the Tutinama is a fine compilation of Indian wisdom represented by the fables of clever and urban personified animals, yogis, gorgeous women and merchants representing all shades of an everyday Indian life with Islamic ideals about kingship, ethics, humility and chastity. Perhaps this encyclopedic knowledge about the contemporary mundane life and the lessons of practical wisdom, kingship and morality embedded in this text attracted the attention of Emperor Akbar, and because of this, 2 illustrated examples of this text survive from his atelier. In both the manuscripts, the prose is frequently punctuated with verses of celebrated Persian poets without acknowledgement, which encapsulates and reiterates the message of the prose. The palimpsest Tutinama manuscript preserved in the Cleveland Museum of Art is nearly complete with 218 miniatures on 341 folios. John Seiler, in a seminal article on this manuscript, has postulated that it is dated to circa 1570 and almost half of its miniatures are overpainted. He added that this manuscript was formerly illustrated in the Chandayan style many decades before it was refurbished in the Mughal atelier. This could be discerned by examining the background of this painting here, which has portions of the previous yellow-colored background visible due to the flaking of the now lavender-colored base on the proper right corner. Further, the earlier drawings of the throne and the bolster are also noticeable. The miniatures are ascribed to several Mughal artists who reworked on the existing painting, rubbing off the previously painted versions, or they directly painted on the earlier ones. They also added where the manuscript had been left incomplete. Most of the illustrations belong to this manuscript are all small-size paintings, which are usually have flat backgrounds before which the figures are suspended. The two-dimensional interior themes are all colored sections, bold textual patterns. Figures are simple, often small. The males dressed in Mughal jama and turban, whereas the females are mostly garbed in the Indian attire of lehenga and choli. Another illustrated version of the Tutinama was created in circa 1580 and it is partly preserved in the Chester Beatty Library, Dublin. It has 143 folios including 102 miniatures and the remaining leaves are scattered in various Western and Indian collections. This manuscript remained in the Imperial Library at least through the reign of Shah Jahan. The paintings which are part of this version of the Tutinama are mostly full-page compositions and are generally free from any major influences from the earlier Cleveland paintings. The painters have created coherent, expressive and lively compositions. By the 8th decade of the 16th century, the painters had gained experience in visualizing narratives with realism by their increased knowledge of the spatial depth and curating figures in action and in relationship to each other. They were also capable of adding psychological nuances to a scene. In comparison to the paintings of the Cleveland Tutinama, the Betty paintings are more attuned according to the Mughal style. As was the norm in that decade, more than one painter contributed to a scene and perhaps their names were written by a librarian on each folio. These are lost to us due to remargining of the folios in the 18th or early 19th century. The Tutinama never gained such popularity, rather thematic similar in the royal circles. One reason is at some places the text appears an assortment of unrelated miscellaneous material. It seems the author has intentionally created this selection of stories in order to make it useful to a large number of people. The language and structure of these parables are direct and easy so that it may even be understood by the uneducated. This brings us to the question of the reception of the Tutinama text. When we take into consideration the theme, context, and the means of transmission of these tales through an illustrated manuscript, we may conclude that even though these tales have similar information about mundane life and the common folk, but in fact these are elite tales carefully collected here for the exclusive consumption of the elite. In the two illustrated versions for the edification and entertainment of the Mughals, perhaps the text consisted of material for the emperor and the members of his inner circle and was received on similar lines. For example, several of the stories have portrayals of ideal kings. Nakshabi tries to educate the reader or the audience to learn from the wisdom and lives of the preceding rulers and their interactions with men of God and their subjects. Further, this work must have directly spoken to the women in the harem because of the strong presence of the females in this work, where they have acted as strong protagonists in the text, illustrated brilliantly in the accompanying miniatures. Supposedly, it was also considered an appropriate reading material for the edification of females on matters of chastity, familial relationships, love, etc., and was meant to be read aloud at court or harem gatherings, which also included women. In the end, I want to thank my mentor, Professor Naman Ahuja. He's been my guiding force. Professor Akhlaq Ahan sir, who has introduced me to the beautiful Persian language. I'm very thankful to you, sir. Dr. Balram Shukla, who read the first draft of this paper. Dr. James Kohler from the Cleveland Museum of Art, who allowed me to use these paintings in my presentation as well as my publication, and the organization and the organizers, especially Mr. Suhail Abidi sir, who's been very kind. Thank you so much. I'm sorry that I'm not in a position to take up any questions today, but I would be happy to answer your questions or engage with your comments at a later date. My email ID is there on the screen, and I'm looking forward to your comments or feedback on my paper. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anjali Duhan. Your paper was really very informative.
Thank you.
So now, Dr. Anjali Duhan was our last speaker for the session. Now I'll request Professor Akhlaq Ahmad Ansari, who is Professor of Persian Language and Literature at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, to please share your views on each paper. Over to you, sir.
Oh,
Anjali, please exit your share. Yes. Okay. Thanks, Rifat, for moderating this session. What a wonderful session and a learning experience. All these three papers. First was presented by Dr. Satoshi Ogura from Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. And his theme is very fascinating towards a comparative study on Mughal Persian translations of Yog Vashisht. There are a few points I would like to share regarding this paper. This is certainly a very excellent and also thought-provoking. He has pointed out many things, and he also mentioned that he is going to edit the Formuli's translation or that manuscript and going to publish it. It is really a wonderful thing. Yog Vasishta, like many other sources, Persian sources, has fascinated many generations of scholars, particularly during the Timurid, or popularly known as the Mughal period. And even later, even after the Dara Shikoh, we see some of the translations of this text. There is one very interesting mention by Dara Shikoh, the translation attributed to him, and that was edited by our teacher, Professor Amir Hassan Abedi and Professor Tara Chand, that he points out two things that are very interesting. One is that he says that why I translated this text. And there he says that I saw a dream, and in that dream, I confronted Vashisht and Ram. And Vashisht introduced me to Ram, and by saying that this prince is like you, he is a pursuer of the real knowledge, or he is in search of the real knowledge, and he should translate this. So that shows, and then we know that Dara Shikoh was keen, very keen in the Indian knowledge tradition. And he is the one who basically became the one who introduced Indian knowledge tradition to the West. We know that Schopenhauer being the means the earliest Westerners who did work on Indology, and he was very much influenced and inspired by the translations of Dara Shikoh. And the second point he writes in that uh, and he says that why, because the translations were done. Your Vasisht was earlier translated, as it is mentioned in this paper. He says that earlier translations were just the word-to-word translation. What was written in the text, it was just word-to-word translations. And he says that I'm going to consult other sources, for example, Puranas, Gita, to substantiate what is mentioned in this text. So in that way, I think this translation, which is attributed to Dara Shikoh, becomes very interesting. And there was another person, Abul Hassan, who also did on who worked on this translation, and it was published by Nawal Kishore in, I think, 1898. And one thing that the manuscript which he says, Dr. Satoshi, that he is going to edit it, I have come across that manuscript, and I have seen the signature of Jahangir. And besides signing, he also says that it was actually translated by him when he was a 19-year-old young man. So that also hints one very interesting point, that in pre-colonial tradition of knowledge, the text languages were not identified or attached with the identities as we see today. We see Mullah Badayuni, a very staunch or conservative Muslim, translating Ramayana and Mahabharata into Persian. That reflects that the people, even the traditional scholars were aware of or very or knew and studied Sanskrit and Sanskrit tradition or other traditions, similarly Bible and other texts. So that is one thing that that this whole debate conveys to us. The second paper is also very interesting and very fascinating, and the way it deals with a very important theme of later Mughal period. A great poet, Bedil, uh, uh, who generally and particularly now we see that in Iran he is being recognized, and a lot of work is being done in Iran. Earlier he was almost unrecognized or neglected, though he was very popular and is popular in Central Asia and in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan even there is one sect called Bedilia. But in India, we have almost neglected his works, literary works. But one point, while there is a lot of work, debates, discussions, writings, and even contemporary Iranian poets are following his style and his tarkibat. But the historical debates or the historical things that is written either openly or he has hinted in his poetry is not much discussed. A few articles or a few writings we can see, and probably first Iqbal was the one who hinted about his political views and what we call that harki element, that potent element regarding the socio-cultural and historical revivalism. And that's why we see lots of tarkibat, words of Bedil taken by Iqbal, like Bange Dara, like Yade Baiza, like Toor. So these are the symbols which basically Iqbal takes from Bedil. So that is also a very interesting paper in which Professor Azarmi Dukht Safavi has uh, uh, um, detailed it and pointed out how Bedil's writings are also very important from the historical point of view, and it is basically a source of history. And earlier we also see that there are many tazkiras, for example, Daulat Shah Samarkandi, or for example, Chahar Maqala, or for example, the Qasaid of Manu Chehri and other qasidas. These all the sources we have, we can see that these have historical importance also, and there are narrations of the historical events. So some of the historians we see use it. For example, Nafaisul Ma'asir is a very important tazkira of poets. Vis-a-vis, it is also a very important historical source about the Akbar's period, and some of the historians have used it. And for example, Manu Chehri writing about Mahmud Ghaznavi's military adventures. So these literary works are also very important historical sources, and I think historians should also pay attention to that. The third paper is by Dr. Anjali Duhan, in spite of the fact she has some personal issues, but she could care to come and present her wonderful paper on Tuti Nama. It is an illustrated text, and she has been working on different art. She is basically an art historian, and this Tuti Nama also we come across the Indian tradition of allegorical writing. And basically, I've also written on allegory tradition in literature, and I come across that basically this allegory tradition is invented by Indian writers, and it was introduced and adapted by first I think Iranians, and then it also gone to the Western world. So by allegory and fables and parables, commenting and critiquing the contemporary socio-political cultural situation is a very distinct style of Indian writing, and the same is we see in Tuti Nama, that is originally in Sanskrit. And the second point we come across and or notice while going through this text is the expression of feminist or the female, we can say, sexual aspirations that are basically a taboo, or more interestingly, we can see one thing that in the pre-colonial era, we do not see sexuality being discussed as a taboo in the academic, I think, academic environment. Many writings we can see with the Tuti Nama as it is presented, for example, Kitabul Ash or even Muraqqah Dehli. So that shows a kind of open discussion about this aspect of human life. And it is very interesting to see that in colonial or post-colonial era, this is becoming a kind of taboo in the literary writings. That was not in fact. The second thing is that the whole story of Tuti Nama becoming popular in the Persian, Perso-Turkish literature, and in Turkish tradition, we can see that women are equally vocal, equally, and then they have, since they are a kind of tribal background traditionally, so female and male are equal in the whole household, and then they do discuss and such things are can be seen in Perso-Turkish or even the Turkish literature. So that was the reason probably why Naqshbandi translated this text into Persian, and why this became a very popular text in that era. So that aspect is also very important. In the last, I would like to thank all the presenters, all the scholars for their wonderful presentation and enlightening us about different aspects of our history, culture, and literature. I would also like to thank Ms. Rifat for comparing this whole session wonderfully, and all the audiences who could care to participate and be part of this seminar, webinar. And this is our basically tribute to our great teacher, late Professor Sayyid Amir Hassan Abidi Saab, who we basically inherit his tradition, and we hope to aspire to do that. I also thank Janab Sayyid Shahid Mehdi Saab, who has been an inspiration and has been guiding us all the way, and Mr. Suhail Abedi Saab, being a very very active and actively pursued this whole thing. Professor SPF Hussaini Sahaba, and I also request to see everyone in the next session, that also going to be wonderful, studied with our wonderful scholars, Professor Hassan Abbas, Dr. Balram Shukla, Dr. Ali Akbar Shah, and others. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
خیلی ممنون استاد از صحبت‌های شما درباره مقاله‌ها خیلی بهره بردیم و صحبت‌های شما درباره مقاله‌ها خیلی جالب بودند. So with this we come to an end of this successful third session of International Sanitary Conference. In this conference, in this session, 3 papers were presented, and near about 42 participants attended the conference. So I thank all the participants for attending this conference too. So for vote of thanks, I'll invite Professor Bilqis Fatma Hussaini to please do the vote of thanks.
No, vote of thanks is in the next session.
Okay, sorry.
We are concluding now.
Okay, sir.
Now
Thank
it
you.
is concluded, and later on in the next session, I will thanks.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, sir.